Following this is a few clips from the March 11th workshop.
And so it is kind of it's for you to hash out.
And then if I can just have one follow-up question, what is the timeline for that decision-making process? Or
It doesn't need to be made immediately, but in the interim, we do have projects that are waiting, that have been delayed. And so the longer we take to make a decision, and we certainly want to be thoughtful about that, the longer those projects are delayed, because there are such impacts and domino effects based upon what we ultimately decide.
Thank you.
Dr. Coker.
Through the chair to Dr. Krisner. So certainly when this first plan was developed, there was a lot of community input and such. As we have this discussion today, what does that look like as we move forward as well? Because we all have constituency up here who are going to get impacted. How are we taking this to the community? Yeah, what does that timeline look like in addition to what Dr. Hershey has discussed?
Thank you, Dr. Coker, and you're right. A lot of thought and community input came into the first original plan. And so I think that the timeline for moving forward and taking this back to the community depends on what you all decide with your recommended policy changes. And so what that looks like and how long that takes depends on how we decide to move forward with policy. Whether or not we take it to an ACE process or whether we have some sort of amended process based upon what other districts are doing. But certainly that would need to be incorporated in the process.
I just think it's important that we're sitting up here talking about very substantial, a high school, and whether it stays or goes is certainly something for us to have discussion about, but it is absolutely something for our community to give input into, and we need to be thinking about that in this timeline as well.
I appreciate that, Dr. Coker.
The next clip is a question that School Board Member Pearson wants the staff to investigate and bring back the answer.
Is there any research or any prevailing thought on the optimal size for a school with a high percentage of English language learner students? And then how the size of a school translates into student performance? Because I understand that we've been talking about larger schools give us more operational savings. But do larger schools necessarily give us increased student performance?
Good question. Other questions as we sit before we move into the next portion? Board Member Jones.
Thank you. Through the chair. Also, and it's probably a bring back too, if we look.
Next slide is School Board Member Jones saying he doesn't want West Side High closed.
That's the only high school that we're closing that we promised to rebuild on site. And that's a problem for me as a district.
Notice in this next clip that School Board Member Carney suggests two alternates. Alternate 2 that she discusses, notice that it says these alternates are developed based on board member feedback.
Through the chair to Board Member Carney, one thing I would just like to know is, what do you like about the plan and what is your preference? Because I think that while we might have individual perspectives about different districts, we don't necessarily live within those districts and understand all the nuances in that community. So it's very important for me as a board member to understand, out of all these, this is my, I don't want to say my favorite. I don't know if you want to go that far, but which is your preference and what you like and what your concerns are?
So I struggle because there's pros and cons to each one.
As you will hear, School Board Member Carney talks about a survey. And as you can see by this screenshot, the survey was sent out January 9th. to Seabreeze parents.
Now, we know that we had surveyed the community about Seabreeze being a K-8. Now, this proposed option, I think, on paper, makes the most sense. I also think the 3 K-8s with my particular community makes sense.
They also discussed other funding proposals, like how much debt might the board be willing to incur instead of closing some schools. They also discussed some of the legislation that happened after the original proposal was made back in 2019. Hopefully you remember that the school board had voted asking us to vote on the referendum in 2019, and the master facility plan was based on that proposal. At that time, we would not have been forced to share a large chunk with charter schools. The plan just said on a needs basis. So they would get, some money for safety upgrades and things like that. And also if the building was going to fall under 1013.625, maybe it would also get some upgrades. If they were leasing this facility, I would hope they weren't going, anyway, that would have been a whole other discussion that unfortunately never happened because the city council blocked us from voting in 2019, and then the state legislators in 2020 passed a law that forced us to give a large chunk of the sales surtax referendum money to charter schools, and that's what we had to vote on if we want to renovate our old school buildings. So that's part of the reason the original plans expected revenue and the revenue that happened after the 2020 legislative session changed. I mentioned this statute earlier, 1013.625, and it reads, if a charter school is non-renewed or terminated, any unencumbered funds and all equipment and property purchased with district public funds shall revert to the ownership of the district school board. And I had mentioned earlier, is the money being spent on leases or is it being spent on assets that will revert to the school board, school district, if the charter school should close? We really need to know the answer to that question, and I hope you'll speak up more loudly about that, because right now we don't know. And this is the timeline that they've come up with. So you can see they're going to be having conversations with the community in May and June, and in July they're going to have another workshop. So speak up. Now's the time. They've also, since the workshop, they've released a frequently asked question. You can find it on their website. And one of them is, are any schools being planned for closure for the upcoming school year, 2024 to 2025? And the answer is none of the consultants' recommendations are being considered for implementation this coming year. The only schools planned for consolidation and closure next year are Pine Estates Elementary and Charter Academy Middle School, which were approved in the original 2019 Master Facilities Plan, with all of these students moving to new or recently renovated school facilities. Also, consider going to one of the Citizen Oversight Committee meetings and make your voice heard that you want to know how the charter schools are spending our sales surtax money. Please do pay attention what the City Council and the state legislators are doing, because they have actually exacerbated this situation. There is some legislation that says that leases aren't supposed to be with related parties. The leases that for charter schools. Many charter schools are leasing their buildings, and they're not supposed to get capital outlay funding, which is what our sales surtax money is, if they have leases with certain related parties. So speak up about finding out about that also, please.